you really just in a few months, January, February, March 2023, if not sooner, we're going to be in a very severe recession. And people are going to be surprised at how quickly inflation comes down. Supply chain is the economy. In other words, if you want to understand the economy, you're really talking about the supply chain at every aspect. Something as simple as a loaf of bread. You buy a loaf of bread at the grocery store. Like, okay, well, I guess it came from a baker, and I guess they took it from the bakery to the store by truck. So there's a supply chain. Well, that's about as simple a version of the supply chain as you can imagine. You have to just start going from there. It's like, well, did the bread come in a plastic wrapper or a paper wrapper? Well, that wrapper came from somebody. Where'd the truck come from? Well, obviously a truck manufacturer. Where'd the driver come from? Somebody had to make a career choice and be trained. And what about the diesel fuel in the truck? That came from a refinery, and that came from oil exploration. Then you get back to the baker, and it's like, oh, well, I guess he had an oven or she had an oven. Where did that come from? And then you find out that the ovens are, industrial ovens have parts from 25 different countries and so forth. Well, without belaboring that point, you get back to the farmer and the wheat and the fertilizer and everything else, and really what's called the extended supply chain. And you're like, wait a second, that's a huge number of countries, a huge number of imports, and a big part of the economy, which it is. And then every link in that supply chain I described has its own supply chain behind it to get to source materials and intermediate manufacturing and so forth. And then that's for a loaf of bread. Well, what about, your alarm clock, your car, your furniture, your clothes, and on and on and on. Again, you see the point that once you start thinking about what supply chains are, you realize it's just the cardiopulmonary system of the entire global economy. So what we're looking at, Julie, is a global recession, and those are rare. It's one thing to say, well, Germany's in a recession, or the U.S. is in a recession, or Japan. Japan's had 9 recessions in the last 30 years. They're in a 30-year depression is a better way to describe it. But usually there's some economy somewhere that's doing okay, and kind of, they used to use the phrase locomotive. It's a locomotive that pulls the rest of the train, out of the ditch or up the hill, as the case may be. But a global recession, which we did have in 2008, with the exception of Australia. Australia seems to be recession-proof, but they did have a recession in 2020. But we're looking at a global recession, and that would be if we're lucky. If we're not lucky, we'll have a global financial panic on top of that. So this is the bigger picture, the macro picture, but it comes at the same time that we see a supply chain breakdown. Why are supply chains breaking down? What's new about the supply chain that makes it different than any other period in the history of the world? And what's new were 2 things, and they arose around 1989. The first was you had a combination of increased computing power, algorithms, artificial intelligence, better data collections. Inflation's here. We all see it. Price of gasoline, eggs, milk, butter, groceries at the store, rents, electricity, home heating, fuel, you name it. Across the board, inflation's affecting everything. And it started really in the mid-2021. Now, so where are we today? Well, we're definitely getting the inflation from the supply side, and that's clear. But so far, it has not tipped into demand pull inflation. Consumer psychology has not changed. We're paying higher prices, but a lot of this is because demand is inelastic, meaning you got to pay the higher price no matter what. If you have to fill up your Ford F-150 pickup truck because you got to get to work or do your job or take the kids to school, whatever, and it used to be $75 and now it's $150 twice a week, you still have to do it. It kind of doesn't matter because you need the gas and you need the truck. Now, where it does impact the economy is if you do that, it's $75 that you don't have for something else. In other words, you're like, okay, I just paid a lot more to fill up my truck with gas or my SUV or whatever, but now I'm going to, not go out to dinner, not go to a concert, not go to a sporting event, not buy a new suit of clothes, etc., because I can't afford it because I put all my money in the gas tank. And the Fed can't do anything about that directly. The Fed does not drill for oil. The Fed does not plant wheat or corn. They do not provide fertilizer. They do not drive trucks. They do not refine diesel fuel. In other words, when you look at all the bottlenecks that we've talked about, the Fed doesn't do any of those things. So they can't affect the supply side of the equation. All they can do is destroy demand by raising interest rates, which they're doing. We saw mortgage rates go up and housing prices come down, and a lot else. Prices are actually starting to come down. We'll talk about that in a minute. But my point being, if the inflation is coming from the demand side and you do some demand destruction, okay, that works, although it can be extreme as it was with Paul Volcker. But if the inflation is coming from the supply side, think about how much demand do you have to destroy to affect the supply side. It's not coming from the demand side, it's coming from the supply side. The answer is a lot. You have to create a severe recession and much higher unemployment to control supply inflation from the demand side. What's going to happen faster than markets and investors expect is that this inflation is going to come down so fast, it's going to be a strong form of disinflation. Now, disinflation is still inflation, but it's lower inflation. And in terms of response functions, it bears a closer resemblance to deflation than it does to inflation, even though it's still a form of inflation. When inflation is coming down, what else is going on? Well, real interest rates are going up, and the economy is slowing down. And then it could even tip into deflation. That would be a shock to the system. I mean, in that world, cash is your best performing asset because the real value of cash actually goes up in deflation when everything else is crashing around you. So yeah, we're in inflation right now. It's painful, but it's starting to fade more quickly than people expect. And my forecast, based on a lot of analysis, and it's all in the book, Sold Out, is that this disinflation, borderline deflation, will prevail. And by really just in a few months, January, February, March 2023, if not sooner, we're going to be in a very severe recession. And people are going to be surprised at how quickly inflation comes down, and they won't be positioned for it in terms of their portfolios. I mean, for example, a 10-year Treasury note would be a very good performing asset in this world because yield maturity on 10-year Treasury notes has been recently 4%, but now it's around 3.5%. That could come down to 2.5% in a heartbeat, even lower, and that would produce huge capital gains. So it's a big deal for investors and asset allocation and portfolio management, and a lot of people don't see the disinflation coming. But the Fed has always said, we don't worry about inflation. We don't like it, but we know how to get rid of it. We just raise rates, and maybe they got to raise them longer and further than people expect, and maybe it's painful. There are costs involved, but they can kill inflation just by raising rates. They don't know how to stop deflation. I mean, how do you stop deflation? You can't raise rates. That'll make it worse. You can go to zero, but that doesn't, once you're at zero, you're at zero. QE doesn't work, by the way. I mean, it's been tried to the tune of like $9 trillion, but the empirical evidence is that it's just, they do QE by buying bonds from the banks, and the banks take the money and give it back to the Fed as excess reserves. That money never goes to the economy. What good does that do? And the answer is it doesn't do any good. So so you can take rates to zero, but you're stuck. Could you have negative interest rates? In theory, yes. In Europe, Switzerland, and Japan did. But there's no evidence that it provided any stimulus. I mean, they did it, but it's like an experiment that didn't work. So the problem with deflation is there's nothing a central bank can do, and it does feed on itself, and it does get worse, and that is a central banker's worst nightmare.